The cabin lights dimmed, the steady hum of the engines filling the silence between clinking glasses and low conversations. Passengers settled into their seats, lulled by the rhythm of the flight, and then without warning, it happened. A drink. Ice cold, acidic with lemon. Not just spilled, but poured across the blouse, the lap, the skin of a black woman in seat 14C. The flight attendant froze. For a second, no one breathed. The woman did not shout. She did not leap up in fury. Instead, she looked directly at the attendant, her eyes steady, her breathing controlled, and whispered just one word. Enough. It was not the volume that silenced the cabin, but the weight. Enough. The word carried years of invisible battles. The kind of battles that play out in boardrooms, classrooms, checkout lines, and now, 30,000 feet in the air. The attendant's hands trembled. A hollow apology stumbled out, but it was laced with something sharp or dismissal, that subtle tilt of the chin, that unspoken belief. She'll take it, she has no choice. But this time, choice sat buckled into seat 14C, calm, composed, calculated. The black woman dabbed at her soaked blouse, never breaking eye contact. Around her, passengers shifted, some pretending not to notice, others holding their breath, waiting to see whether she would overreact or behave. And here's where the story tightens its grip. Rather than escalating in anger, she pressed the call button with deliberate precision. The chime rang out, crisp and undeniable. The cabin crew exchanged glances, and within minutes, what began as a spill spiraled into something far greater, because she was not about to let this incident vanish into silence. What no one on that flight realized, not the passengers, not the attendants, not even the captain, was that a single decision, made in that moment, would ground the plane. Here's what that moment teaches us. Power is rarely about volume, it is about presence, about knowing when the world expects your silence, and choosing instead to speak with precision. She didn't know it yet, but her next move would force an entire system to reveal itself. A single action, in a space where most people feel powerless, flipped the entire outcome. And the question that lingers in the air for us is this. What happens when one woman, carrying centuries of resilience in her blood, decides that enough means not just for her, but for everyone watching? The drink was just the beginning. The real turbulence was about to begin. Before the glass tipped, before the lemon sting in the hush of passengers, before she whispered enough, there was a history. Her name was Dr. Lena Carter, 42 years old, a professor of organizational psychology, traveling back from a keynote in Boston, where she had spoken about, ironically, bias in high-stakes environments. Her research focused on microaggressions, those tiny, often denied slights that accumulate like invisible cuts, until they bleed into identity, self-worth, and opportunity. She knew the science, but she also knew the scars. From her very first job interview fresh out of graduate school, when the recruiter smiled and asked if she was sure she belonged in such a competitive field, to the boardroom years later, when her strategic ideas were dismissed, until repeated by a colleague with lighter skin and deeper pockets. Bias didn't always wear a hood or raise its voice. Often it wore a smile, carried a tray, or sat behind a gate of polite professionalism. And for black women like Lena, flights were no different. Studies show that black travelers are more likely to be questioned about their seat assignments, second-guessed about their baggage, or spoken to with clipped tones by airline staff. A 2019 survey revealed that black women reported the highest levels of microaggressions during travel, compared to any other demographic. So when that drink spilled not by accident but with a flick of indifference that landed harder than the ice, it struck more than fabric. It struck memory. But here's the deeper truth. Lena wasn't just reacting to her own moment. She carried the echoes of her grandmother, who'd been refused service at a whites-only lunch counter. She carried her mother's sighs, forced to work twice as hard in a corporate world that questioned every promotion. She carried every sideways glance, every forced smile, every "you must be overreacting" that black women endure daily. She didn't know it yet, but that single whispered enough was about to channel all of it. Now here's the root cause we need to understand. Systems thrive on silence. Whether it's corporate discrimination, biased policing, or everyday microaggressions, these systems are sustained when people believe their only option is to endure. Airplanes are perfect examples of controlled environments. Passengers are conditioned to comply, to not make a scene, to let inconveniences slide. Because there's nothing you can do up here, authority feels absolute when the doors are sealed and the seatbelt signs are on. But Lena's training had taught her something different. Compliance without choice is not peace, it is suppression. The incident didn't just happen in a vacuum. It was part of a pattern, repeated across industries, across decades. A pattern designed to remind people like her of their place. And so, when the drink spilled, Lena stood at a moral fork in the road. She could do what she had done dozens of times before. Smile it off, change her blouse in the restroom, file a complaint that would disappear into corporate silence. Or, she could challenge it here, now, 30,000 feet above the ground. And here's what that moment teaches us. Injustice is never just about the incident, it's about the system that allows the incident to happen over and over again. She didn't yet realize that pressing that call button would not only summon a crew member, it would summon accountability. It would drag a hidden structure of bias out into the fluorescent light of that cabin, where everyone would have to see it. The drink was no longer just a spill, it was a spark. And sparks, when ignored, start fires. The call button glowed overhead, its soft chime still echoing faintly through the cabin. Passengers shifted in their seats, their eyes darting between Lena and the flight attendant, who now stood rigid, clutching the empty cup as though it were a shield. This was the fork in the road. On one side was the well-worn path, compliance, let it go. Don't risk being labeled difficult, angry, or disruptive. For black women, those words are more than stereotypes. They're weapons, sharpened by repetition and wielded to silence. Lena had walked that path before, too many times. On the other side was risk. To demand accountability was to step into a dangerous spotlight. She knew the risks intimately. Airline staff hold immense authority in the air. A passenger labeled uncooperative can be escorted off, blacklisted, even arrested. And for black passengers, the consequences are often magnified, misinterpreted, or weaponized. It would be expected for Lena to retreat. After all, who argues with a uniform 30,000 feet in the air? Who risks turning a flight into a spectacle? But here sits the truth. Every system of injustice depends on this exact moment. It thrives when people convince themselves, it's not worth it. Keep your head down, survive. Lena's heart pounded. She could feel the weight of all the stories she'd studied in her research. The psychology of learned helplessness, a condition in which individuals stop resisting harm because they believe resistance is futile. The physiology of stress, how cortisol floods the body, pressing fight or flight into submission. The history of black women on flights, ignored complaints, brushed off dignity, dismissed humanity. And yet, she also remembered another truth. Her grandmother once told her, silence never kept us safe, it just kept us invisible. So Lena inhaled slowly, grounding herself the way she had taught countless students in her classroom. Breath steady, shoulders squared, eyes locked. She was not merely reacting, she was choosing. And in that choice, the dilemma became something else. A decision not about spilled liquid, but about dignity, about the right to exist without swallowing disrespect. She could feel the eyes of the passengers now, some nervous, some sympathetic, some irritated, as though her discomfort were an inconvenience to their smooth journey. But she also knew this silence would not just erase her, it would teach every watching eye, including the young black girl in row 17, clutching her teddy bear, that silence is the only option. Here's what that moment teaches us. Moral forks in the road rarely arrive with fanfare. They arrive disguised as inconveniences, accidents, or tiny injustices, and the choice we make in those quiet moments determines whether the system strengthens or cracks. Lena pressed her palms flat against the damp fabric of her blouse, as though to anchor herself in the discomfort. Then, with a calm that belied the storm beneath, she said clearly, so every nearby passenger could hear, "I would like to speak to the captain." The words cut through the recycled air like a blade. The attendant blinked, stunned. "Yes," Lena replied, "now." And in that instant, the fork in the road narrowed into a single path. She had chosen to risk exposure, confrontation, and judgment, not for spectacle, but for justice. She didn't know it yet, but those words would trigger a chain reaction. The captain's involvement would transform a minor spill into an undeniable event, one that could not be dismissed or laughed off. The system had been challenged, mid-air. And systems, once challenged, reveal their true faces. The air inside the cabin seemed to tighten as Lena Sepp's words lingered. "I would like to speak to the captain." Passengers exchanged looks. Some widened their eyes in disbelief. Others smirked, already preparing to dismiss her as overreacting. The flight attendant hesitated, glancing nervously toward the galley, torn between protocol and pressure. Most people on that plane assumed Lena had overplayed her hand. After all, who calls for the captain over a spilled drink? They didn't realize she was playing a different game. Here's what most missed. Lena had spent her career studying the psychology of authority. She understood that power doesn't always belong to the loudest person in the room. It belongs to the person who frames the situation. And right now, she wasn't framing this as a spill. She was framing it as an incident, a breach of dignity, something significant enough to require escalation. That shift in language, subtle yet seismic, changed everything. The attendant faltered. She tried again, her voice clipped, "Mastam, there sits no need to disturb the captain over." Lena interrupted, calm but firm, "Yes, there is." Notice what she did there. No raised voice, no anger, just unshakable precision. because Lena understood another truth. When bias is involved, emotion is often used as a weapon against the oppressed. Anger becomes aggression. Tears become hysteria, but calm, measured insistence, that disarms the narrative. She didn't know it yet, but her control was her sharpest weapon. As the attendant reluctantly disappeared toward the cockpit, Lena opened her carry-on bag. From within, she pulled a small leather notebook. Not flashy, not dramatic, just a scholar's tool. With slow, deliberate movements, she began writing. Details, times, names, actions. Passengers watched. Curiosity piqued. Why was she documenting? Why was she so steady? Because Lena knew another truth from her research: documentation turns experience into evidence. Injustice thrives in shadows. In he said, she said, but notes, times, written accounts, those turn bias into facts that can be challenged. And here's where her hidden power deepened further. This wasn't just personal. She was trained in systemic thinking. She understood organizational pressure points. What companies feared most: public accountability, legal exposure, viral narratives. While others thought she was just a passenger with a stained blouse, Lena was quietly positioning herself as a strategist. Think about this. In history, countless acts of resistance looked ordinary at first glance. Rosa Parks simply stayed seated. Claudette Colvin did the same before her. Each action looked small until it shifted the entire frame of what was acceptable. Lena's calm demand for the captain, her open act of documentation, her unwavering presence in her seat, these were not small gestures. They were calculated disruptions of a system designed to minimize her. The attendant reappeared, face tense. The captain will speak with you once we've reached cruising altitude, she announced stiffly. Lena nodded. Not a victory, not yet, but a crack. Here's what that moment teaches us. Hidden power is not always about what you do in public. It is about what you know in private, about carrying tools, frameworks, and discipline that others cannot see until the moment you reveal them. Passengers turned back to their seats, some whispering, some shaking their heads, but something had shifted. This wasn't just a spill anymore, it was a stage, and Lena, without raising her voice, had positioned herself at its center. The irony is, most still underestimated her. They thought this was about a ruined blouse. They didn't yet realize that this calm woman in 14C was about to make the entire plane confront itself. And as Lena closed her notebook, resting it neatly on the tray table, one thing became clear: the system was about to push back. The cabin settled into uneasy silence, but Lena could feel it. The shift. Authority never yields without resistance. Systems are designed to protect themselves, and when you challenge them, they push back. It began subtly. The flight attendant returned with another crew member, a man this time, tall, shoulders squared, voice clipped with rehearsed authority. "Ma'am," he said, leaning just close enough to invade her space, "we understand there was an incident, but it's not appropriate to escalate this to the captain. Please relax and enjoy the flight." The word relax landed heavier than the spill itself. For black women it was a familiar command, a dismissal disguised as courtesy. Passengers nearby nodded in agreement, eager for the disruption to end. Others avoided eye contact, unwilling to take sides. And Lena sat there, her blouse still damp, her notebook still open, caught in the center of their collective expectation. Let it go. Don't disturb the order of things. Here's the thing about order. It often exists to protect those in power, not those who are wronged. The attendant's partner folded his arms, waiting. The implication was clear. She had been marked as a problem. One more word, one more uncooperative gesture, and the situation could tip into danger, written into a report, distorted into a narrative where she was the aggressor. And then came the humiliation. A passenger across the aisle muttered loudly enough for others to hear, "Some people just like to make trouble. It's just a drink." A chuckle followed, sharp as glass. Another voice added, "If she can sit handle that, maybe she shouldn't sit fly." Lena's chest tightened. She could feel her pulse rising, her body betraying the calm she had worked so hard to hold. This was the breaking point. Psychology often describes the moment when isolation magnifies pain, when public dismissal deepens private wounds. For a moment she almost faltered. She thought about her students, her research, her family. Would they tell her she had gone too far? Would she be the cautionary tale, the woman who got herself thrown off a flight over a drink? Her hand trembled slightly against the tray table, her notebook, her anchor, blurred before her eyes. And here's where the science comes in. Under public stress, the body triggers what psychologists call amygdala hijack. Rational thought narrows, fight or flight takes over, and we are pulled toward reaction rather than strategy. Systems rely on this. They rely on pressure to force collapse. The humiliation deepened as the second attendant leaned closer, lowering his voice, but not his disdain. "If you continue to disrupt Miss, we may have to involve security when we land. I hate for things to go that way." Passengers glanced sideways, whispers circulating. Lena was no longer just the woman with the stained blouse. She was now the spectacle, the problem. This was the fracture point. Would she retreat? Would she allow their framing to become truth? Her eyes stung, not with weakness, but with the weight of the centuries pressing on this single moment. She remembered her grandmother's words. She remembered her research. She remembered the young black girl in row 17, watching quietly, absorbing everything. And then for the first time since the spill, Lena closed her eyes. She took one long deliberate breath, grounding herself against the tide of humiliation. Here's what that moment teaches us. Systems will test you until you doubt yourself. They will corner you until silence feels safer than dignity. But breakdown is not the end. It is the doorway to transformation. Passengers may have thought she was retreating, but in truth, Lena was preparing for the turn. She didn't know it yet, but this breaking point would ignite her most powerful resolve. The turbulence inside the cabin had only begun. The humiliation still lingered in the air, thick as recycled oxygen. The passengers had turned back to their movies, their books, their quiet judgments. The attendants stood watchful, satisfied they had contained the disruption. But inside Lena, something shifted. Her eyes remained closed, her breath steadying. She remembered something she'd taught her students many times. When you can't control the environment, control the frame. The frame wasn't a spilled drink. It wasn't a difficult passenger. It wasn't even a disturbance on board. The true frame was accountability in a closed system. That realization was the spark. She opened her eyes slowly, no longer trembling. Her notebook sat open on the tray, her pen resting neatly against the page. She picked it up again, not frantically, but deliberately. She wrote one sentence. Escalation attempted. Threat of security noted. Simple, clean, factual. And then, with a clarity that surprised even her, she slid her phone from her bag and opened the voice recorder. She tapped record, laying it face up on the tray table, visible to anyone who passed. The attendants noticed. One stiffened, whispering to the other. They knew what it meant. Once recorded, dismissing her account would be far harder. Here's what that moment teaches us. Strategy is not always about confrontation. Sometimes it is about creating undeniable evidence in a system designed to deny you. But the real turning point came not from her tools, but from her mind. She recalled a study she had published just months earlier. Individuals under pressure, who reframe stress as preparation rather than danger, perform better. Their hearts may race, their palms may sweat, but instead of collapse, their bodies channel the energy into action. So she reframed it. This wasn't her breaking point. This was her preparation. She didn't have to fight every whisper, every dismissive glance, every petty attempt to silence her. She only needed to move with precision, choosing her actions carefully, so that when the captain arrived, the truth would be undeniable. And then came the final spark. She looked down the aisle toward row 17. The little girl with the teddy bear was still watching, her eyes wide, her body pressed against her mother's arm. Lena saw in her gaze a question, unspoken but heavy. What do we do when they try to erase us? That gaze steadied her more than anything else, because this was no longer just about her. This was about every young black girl told to calm down when she demanded fairness. Every black woman labeled angry when she asked for respect. Every professional discredited, every traveler dismissed, every grandmother silenced. Lena straightened in her seat. Her blouse was still damp, but her presence had shifted from target to anchor. She whispered to herself, not for the attendants, not for the passengers, but for the girl in row 17, and for her grandmother Sip's memory. Not this time. That was the pivot, not a dramatic outburst, not a shouted demand, just the quiet certainty of a woman who knew the system could bend under the right pressure. She didn't know it yet, but that single reframing, not danger but preparation, was the seed of her silent comeback. The turbulence had steadied within her. The next phase was execution. And the plane, still cruising smoothly above the clouds, had no idea that its course, literal and moral, was about to change. The hum of the engines filled the silence, masking the tension, simmering in row 14. Lena sat composed now, shoulders back, notebook open, phone recording steadily on the tray. She wasn't fighting anymore, she was building. Execution began not with confrontation, but with presence. Every move she made was deliberate. She sipped water calmly, her hands steady. She jotted notes with quiet precision. Passengers glanced at her, then away again, unsettled by her composure. Because when someone refuses to play the role you've assigned them, angry, irrational, defeated, it unsettles the script. The attendants noticed too. Their whispers grew sharper, their glances toward her more frequent, but she didn't look at them. She wasn't chasing their validation. She was documenting, recording, building her case like a lawyer preparing for trial. Here's what that moment teaches us. Execution doesn't always look like action. Sometimes it looks like discipline, like refusing to be baited, refusing to give the system the reaction it expects. Then came her next step, subtle, quiet, devastating. She slid her notebook halfway into the aisle, not dramatically, but just enough for the man across from her to glimpse the neat factual sentences. Drink deliberately spilled, refusal of apology, threat of security noted. His brow furrowed, he shifted uncomfortably. And just like that, the bystander effect, the human tendency to ignore injustice when no one else acts, began to weaken. Because when evidence appears, silence feels like complicity. Moments later, the woman behind her leaned forward. Do you need a witness? She whispered, her voice hesitant but genuine. Lena turned slightly, meeting her eyes with calm gratitude. Yes, please. It was small, but it mattered. She wasn't alone anymore. That's how execution works. One ally at a time. Quiet wins, no applause yet, just steady accumulation. The attendants tried once more, their tone clipped with impatience. Tom, we still ask you again to stop recording. This is not permitted. Lena didn't raise her voice. She simply tapped her pen against the open page and replied evenly. Federal law allows passengers to record non-private interactions with crew, except well within my rights. The firmness, the legal precision, it rattled them. They weren't dealing with a confused passenger. They were dealing with someone who had studied the rules, who understood the leverage points. And that's when the silence shifted again. Passengers who had ignored her before began watching closely, not because she was loud, but because she was exact. Here's the brilliance of her climb. She wasn't seeking a dramatic confrontation. She was laying a foundation so solid that when the climax arrived, the truth would be undeniable. Minute by minute, she regained the narrative. She wasn't the spectacle anymore. She was the calm center, the one documenting, the one asserting rights without fury, the one forcing the system to reveal itself. And as the plane leveled into cruising altitude, the cockpit door finally opened. The captain emerged, tall, uniform crisp, face carved with practiced authority. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. The attendants rushed forward, already framing their story with hushed urgency. But Lena sat still, notebook open, phone recording, posture unyielding. She didn't need to interrupt. She didn't need to plead. She had already set the stage. Here's what that moment teaches us. Execution is often invisible until the moment of reversal. By the time the world sees it, the groundwork has already been laid. Lena had been climbing silently, step by step. Now the summit was near. And when the captain's eyes finally met hers, it was no longer a question of whether he would hear her. The only question was, what would he do when he realized the entire cabin was already listening? The captain stood in the aisle, his presence drawing every eye. Authority had entered the stage. The flight attendants leaned in quickly, their voices hushed but urgent, weaving their version of the story. A minor spill, a disruptive passenger, unnecessary escalation. They spoke fast, hoping to define the frame before Lena could open her mouth. But Lena didn't rush. She simply sat, notebook open, phone recording visibly on the tray, her gaze steady. She had already built her case. All she had to do was let the evidence breathe. The captain turned toward her. His expression was firm but curious. Stiam, I understand there's been a situation. Can you explain what happened? This was the moment of reversal. Lena spoke with calm precision, every word measured. She described the spill, the dismissive apology, the attempt to silence her, the threats of security, no embellishment, no raised voice, just facts, layered carefully, like a professor presenting a case study. And then she slid her notebook forward, dates, times, details, all written in neat, deliberate handwriting. Finally, she gestured lightly to her phone. This has all been documented. The cabin seemed to shift. The captain glanced at the attendants, their faces flushing. For the first time the power dynamic had flipped. They were no longer accusers, they were being held accountable, publicly, with evidence in front of their superior, and a plane full of witnesses. Here's what that moment teaches us. Truth is most powerful when it is undeniable, and denial becomes impossible when evidence meets composure. The captain's brow furrowed. He asked the attendants, "Is this accurate?" They stammered, fumbling for words. Their confidence cracked. The passengers watched closely now, their whispers carrying a different tone, curiosity, sympathy, even solidarity. The narrative had shifted from disruptive passenger to something seems wrong here. And then Lena delivered the quiet strike. She didn't accuse. She didn't demand. She simply said, "All I want is respect. If that cannot be ensured, then this flight cannot continue safely for me, or anyone else." It was a masterstroke, not a personal grievance, but a matter of safety. She had widened the frame beyond herself, forcing the captain to see the issue as systemic, not situational. The cabin fell silent. The weight of her words lingered. If that cannot be ensured, then this flight cannot continue safely. Passengers shifted uneasily. No one wanted to be on a flight compromised by unresolved conflict. The stakes had just risen from personal to collective. The captain exhaled, his authority pressed into a corner. After a long pause, he turned to the attendants. Apologize properly, and ensure this passenger is treated with respect for the remainder of the flight. Gasps rippled through the cabin. The reversal was complete. The very system that had tried to silence her had been forced publicly to acknowledge her dignity. The attendants' faces flushed crimson as they muttered apologies, their voices hollow, stripped of the power they once wielded. Lena didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply nodded, returning to her seat with the same calm composure she had carried from the beginning. Because this was never about revenge, it was about transformation. And here's the deeper truth. Victories like this rarely come with cheers or standing ovations. They come with silence. An uncomfortable silence where power has shifted, and everyone must sit with what they've just witnessed. The passengers who once dismissed her now sat differently, processing, some ashamed, some awakened. And the little girl in row 17? She stared wide-eyed, her teddy bear clutched tightly, watching a lesson she would never forget. A single action, taken with calm precision, can flip an entire system. The drink had been spilled, the plane had not yet landed, but the tables? They had already turned. The flight resumed its quiet hum, but the energy in the cabin was no longer the same. It wasn't just air pressure at 35,000 feet, it was the weight of a collective shift. Passengers sat differently now. The whispers that once carried irritation or judgment had quieted into a reflective hush. Some leaned into the aisle, stealing glances at Lena as though seeing her for the first time. Others avoided her gaze altogether, ashamed of their earlier silence. The attendants moved stiffly, every step measured, their authority fractured. For the remainder of the flight, their service was cautious, deliberate, tinged with the fear of further exposure. They had not just been corrected, they had been unmasked. And the captain? He spent the next hours making quiet rounds, ensuring visible professionalism. His earlier hesitation gave way to something softer, respect. It was clear he understood. This was more than a customer service dispute. It was a test of leadership, and he had been forced to choose justice in real time. Here's what that moment teaches us. The cost of accountability isn't just paid by the one who speaks, it ripples outward, reshaping everyone who witnesses it. Lena, for her part, didn't revel in the victory. She sat calmly, notebook closed, her phone tucked away, her body finally relaxing into the seat. She had fought the battle without raising her voice, without theatrics, without losing herself, and now, she allowed herself the smallest exhale of release. But the true redemption unfolded quietly, in the eyes of the bystanders. Midway through the flight, the little girl in row 17 whispered something to her mother. Her mother leaned forward, catching Lena's attention, and mouthed a quiet thank you. That small exchange meant more than the captain's apology, because it wasn't just about correcting a wrong, it was about planting a seed in the next generation. That dignity must never be negotiated, and silence is not the price of survival. When the plane finally touched down, passengers began to rise. Normally it's a scramble, a rush to grab bags, to push forward. But on this flight, there was hesitation. People glanced back at Lena, some offering small nods of respect, others too uncomfortable to acknowledge her at all. Redemption rarely comes wrapped in applause, it comes in the quiet, lingering awareness that something within you has shifted. The attendants disembarked quickly, their faces tight, avoiding eye contact. They would carry this incident with them, perhaps as a scar, perhaps as a lesson. For some it might harden them, for others it might open a door toward growth. The captain paused at the exit, waiting as Lena gathered her things. He lowered his voice. Thank you for how you handled yourself. Not everyone could have done that. Lena looked at him, steady as ever. Everyone can. Most just don't realize it yet. That was her gift, not only reclaiming her own dignity, but showing others that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it documents, sometimes it simply refuses to move, until respect is restored. As Lena stepped off the plane, the air in the terminal felt different, lighter, freer. The ordeal was over, but its imprint remained. Here's the deeper truth. Redemption is never just personal. It is communal. It forces a system, however briefly, to reckon with itself. Some passengers would tell this story at dinner tables that night, reflecting on what they had witnessed. Others would bury it, unwilling to face their own silence. But the seed had been planted, and that in itself was a kind of redemption. Because she hadn't just demanded an apology, she had grounded the plane, not in altitude, but in morality. And she didn't know it yet, but her refusal to be diminished would ripple far beyond that flight. When Lena walked out of that terminal, she carried no trophy, no headline, no spotlight, just her bag, her notebook, and her quiet dignity intact. But that's the hidden nature of legacy. It rarely announces itself in the moment. It unfolds in the lives it touches, in the subtle shifts of conscience, in the seeds of courage planted in silence. That little girl in row 17 would grow up remembering more than a spilled drink. She would remember the way a black woman refused to bow, refused to be erased, refused to let disrespect define the air she breathed. She would remember the silence of others, yes, but she would also remember the power of one calm voice that shifted the entire room. And here's what that moment teaches us. The legacy of resistance isn't measured by applause, but by the people it awakens. Consider the attendants. Their careers continued, no doubt, but never again could they step into a cabin without recalling the day the tables turned. For them, Lena's refusal was a mirror. They had been trained to believe power flowed in one direction. That day they learned otherwise. The captain, too, carried the lesson. For him, leadership was no longer just about schedules and safety protocols. It was about moral courage, about intervening when dignity was on the line. A single encounter reframed his understanding of what it meant to command a plane. And for the silent passengers, some would later admit, quietly, that they should have spoken sooner. Others would deny their complicity, but all of them carried an imprint, an undeniable awareness that they had witnessed the turning of a tide. This is the quiet brilliance of Lena's legacy. She didn't just restore her own dignity, she redefined what was possible in that space. She reminded everyone on that flight and beyond, that dignity is not a favor to be granted, it is a baseline, non-negotiable. She showed us that calm is not weakness, that documentation is not paranoia, that silence, when wielded with strategy, can be the sharpest blade of all. And she left us with a challenge. What do you do when it's your turn? Because make no mistake, it will come. Perhaps not on a plane, perhaps in a boardroom, a classroom, a courtroom, or even your own living room. You will be confronted with a moment where your dignity, or someone else's, is placed on the table, ready to be diminished. In that moment, you'll face the same fork Lena did to shrink for safety, or to stand for transformation. Here's the truth most people miss. A single action can flip the entire outcome. It won't always be dramatic, it won't always make headlines, but every time we refuse to let disrespect slide, every time we hold systems accountable, even in small ways, we widen the possibility for justice. So let Lena's story be more than a parable, let it be a template. Carry your notebook, use your phone, protect your composure, document the truth. And when the time comes, speak in a voice so steady that no system can ignore it. Because justice is not built in courtrooms alone, it is built in planes, in offices, in classrooms, wherever dignity is tested and reclaimed. And if this story resonated with your values, if it reminded you of the power that lives in calm resistance, then I invite you, like, comment, subscribe. Not for vanity, but because every voice added here strengthens a community that refuses to shrink, that refuses to be erased, that insists on grounding injustice wherever it tries to fly. Lena's flight ended hours later, but her lesson, that continues in us. And maybe that's the real legacy, not just that she stood tall, but that we now know, we must too.